now at the point at the end of the presidential section, much like when we got to the end of the legislative section, I said I wanted to kind of bring everything together, put it in a box, and get a bow on the top. We are now at that when we get to in the presidential section. One of the realities of understanding the presidency is that we quickly understand that the office itself was created to be subordinate. However, today, it is hard to imagine its position not being at least co-equal, if not superior. So the problem becomes, how do you reconcile the fact that this office has changed dramatically, despite the fact that its creation, Article 2, has not? I would argue that Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution is as close to a job description for the president that we have, except we know full well that Article 2 is smaller than Article 1. It has fewer words, fewer powers, and the founders did not want it to be a dominating force. We didn't trust centralized rule. So I think what we need to be able to do with the benefit of hindsight of 230 years and 45 case studies of this is to create a better job description than Article 2 really provides. So the way in which I want to do that is what's called a hat write-up, or at least what I refer to it as a hat write-up. Hat write-ups are usually used in places that have incredibly high turnover in jobs. Training new people is always a challenge, so especially in places where those people come in and they leave quickly. Hat write-up is a very specific job description. It is created to the point of specificity that you should be able to pull somebody off the street, hand them this hat write-up, and they could get doing their job very quickly. So what I think we need to do is to create that better job description. So what I want to talk about are presidential roles. These are the things that presidents tend to do. Some of these things are in the Constitution. They're formalized powers, but many of them are not. The presidential role we want to talk about is staffing. The president is a fairly substantial human resource director. Human resource directors are basically in charge of hiring and firing. Presidents do that within the White House. So we want to look at how presidents hiring and firing people to serve the president has changed over time. One of the realities of this particular role is that the presidency has dramatically changed over time. Usually, for convenience and ease sake, we argue of a line of demarcation between what presidencies used to be and what they are today. Pre-modern presidents usually mean from the time of George Washington's presidency up to FDR. FDR kind of appears to be that kind of line of demarcation where the presidency changed dramatically. So we want to look at staffing requirements for presidents pre-FDR. To give you some idea of staffing responsibilities for early presidents, I would point to the following examples. George Washington paid his nephew out of his own pocket to be his only full-time aide when he was president. Congress did not appropriate any money to hire staff for the president until the middle of the 1800s. Lincoln, who I believe we would all agree was president during a pretty important period in our history, had a staggering White House staff of 4. And then finally, my favorite example here is Grover Cleveland. My favorite example because Grover Cleveland was a pretty interesting president. He was the only president to serve in office, leave, and then come back and serve. And what's interesting about Grover Cleveland's presidency is that when he came for his second term, if you would call the White House on the phone, Grover Cleveland picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Grover Cleveland, president." That is clearly not our case today. If we decided to call 1-800 the White House right now and ask for Don, we wouldn't get him. And that's because our expectation for the job has changed dramatically. We expect a lot more out of the president in today's society than we used to. That leads us to the postmodern president, today's president. Today's presidents, the demand on the president and the support and the decision making and the problem solving that they're supposed to do today are much higher than they've been in the past. Today's demands on the presidency make it a necessity that he has lots of people to kind of help him do all the problem solving, all the policy making that we kind of demand of modern presidents today. Two places that we see huge staffing increases in the postmodern presidency include the White House staff. The White House staff are those people that the president hires that can number in the hundreds, that kind of serve the president's self. He hires them to take slings and arrows for him. And a second place would be in the EOP, which is an acronym for the Executive Office of the Presidency. The EOP was created in FDR's presidency to kind of be a mini bureaucracy, to kind of help the president and the White House manage the executive branch. FDR created the EOP because we had created vast expansions in government services and programs, and we needed people to kind of get up to speed and be able to understand how these programs and policies were put in place and how they were working. Presidents can have hundreds, if not low thousands of numbers in the EOP helping him do his job, and these people all serve the president's interest. They're not necessarily serving the public's interest. They are working to make sure that the presidency is functioning. And if you put that into kind of context, if you were a president and you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people working for you, doing what you needed to do, your power base would grow exponentially. To kind of put this kind of staffing change in some sort of context, I would point you in the fact that Nancy Reagan, who was the first lady in the 1980s, had a staff that was larger than FDR's during the New Deal. This idea of a president being in charge has changed the office dramatically and caused them to hire tremendous amounts of staff. Some specific staffers that fit into this area here, particularly in the EOP, would be a chief of staff, the director of management and budget, a national security director, and special assistants on every kind of issue that you can imagine, trade and civil rights and fitness and anything else that you can kind of think of. The next role would be administrative. Clearly, presidents are managers of the executive branch. They run one of the three branches of the government. In order to do that, you take on quite a few responsibilities. The first responsibility administratively that presidents do is they appoint. Now, I know that there's an initial reaction when we start talking about administrative appointment, and you probably could easily say, well, you just did that. You talked about staffing. What we're talking about here is appointing people to the executive branch. And that is slightly different than the staffing criteria. The staffing criteria, we argued, was basically the president hiring people to work for him. When we move on to this administrative appointing function, we're talking about the president appointing people to the executive branch. I would also include here the president appoints people to the judiciary with judge appointments, but I want to remove that because that's kind of a special case because they have lifetime appointments. But the president is in charge of putting people in position within the executive branch, the heads of departments and agencies, U.S. ambassadors, U.S. marshals, those kinds of people. And what's unique about these kinds of appointments is that they are not done by the president by himself. When the president appoints someone, say the attorney general to head the Justice Department, the president is charged with appointing that person. However, he does not do this alone. The Senate has to approve. So in many of these administrative appointments, it would seem, at least on the surface, that the president is only partial responsible for this type of function. In fact, if the president were to appoint you or I to be the Attorney General of the United States, you wouldn't get that job unless the Senate approved you through advice and consent. So in my mind, if the president appointed me to be the Attorney General and I got the job, I would have two masters. I would have one master being the president, because if he didn't appoint me, I wouldn't have the job. But if the Senate didn't approve me, I wouldn't have the job either. So in my mind, I would have to send two thank you cards. First card to the president saying thank you for the appointment to the job, and then a second one to the Senate saying thank you for confirming me. And that kind of lends itself to having two masters. This reality of two masters, though, is challenged, and that is because, for the most part, on most of these positions, the thought process is that you serve at the behest of the president. Although the Senate can think you're doing a bad job, and the Senate can drag you in front of their hearings and say that you're doing a bad job, people that are appointed to these positions tend to stay as long as the president wants them to stay. It is at the president's request that you leave. So even though the president is appointing 1,000+ people to these administrative positions and they don't get the job without Senate approval, it's basically the president that informally gets to tap you on the shoulder and say, it's time for you to go spend more time with your family. And if that's the case, I think those people that are getting these jobs don't look at it as a even division of having two masters. One of them is a lot more powerful than the other, so they end up supporting the president and not the Congress or the Senate specifically that allowed them to get the job. And that is going to raise the president's power. He's got again 1,000+ people that serve kind of his ability, because they're so reliant on getting their job through him. The next administrative component would be the budget. Obviously, budgeting is a huge importance. We talked about the importance of money as a resource. So budget, especially federal budgets that can be as high as $4.5, $5 trillion are really impressive. And after I just said that, I realized that I probably messed up there, because I know that the Constitution says that the power of the purse, the power of the budget, is given to Congress. It seems to me if I put this in the wrong place, this should have been something we talked about more extensively in the legislative section. Except I'm not changing it, and that's because Congress has basically abdicated a lot of the responsibility of budgets to the president. And they've done so because they're smart. If you look at the federal budget pie, which this year is going to be $4.5 or $5 trillion, and you break it down according to branch, you'll find that there's a very small sliver of that federal budget, that $5 trillion that goes towards Congress. Yes, Congress gets paid, and they have staffing, and they have office space that needs to be heated and lit, and they need copy paper. But if you add all that up, it's not that much. And Congress, who does have the power of the purse, tells the president, this is how much money we need, and the president says, you get it all. We also know that in the judiciary, we have approaching 100 federal courts that need to hire judges and have clerks and also have office space and all those other things. And I also know the Constitution says that the Congress is in charge of the judiciary. Remember, it says that we're going to have one Supreme Court and other courts that Congress may deem necessary. So Congress knows how much money that the judiciary is going to need, and if you add up those funds, it's a really small sliver again. Well, if you've got two small slivers out of three, that means that last sliver is not much of a sliver, it's a huge hunk, and that's the executive branch. And Congress realizes that the head of the executive branch, the president, probably knows more about how much money they're going to need than Congress does. So Congress has basically ordered the president to say, why don't you tell us how much money you need for your branch of the government? So the president pretty much determines how much money the executive branch is going to need. And if you think about it, the biggest the biggest departmental spending we do is in the Defense Department, approaching $1 trillion. Well, the president is in charge of that. Our biggest programs of Social Security and Medicare are housed in underneath the president. He knows how much they're going to need. So he basically has been given Congress has abdicated the responsibility of coming up with a budget for most of the federal government. Now, that's a huge abdication, giving away the power of the purse. Now, it makes sense to do it. The president knows more about how many paper clips the Labor Department is going to use, but it's a huge abdication. So Congress oftentimes wants to make sure the president realizes that they're not truly in charge of the budget. This is just something that we're handing them. So one of the things that we kind of notice is that Congress has a tendency to find the president's favorite program and kind of cut it. So one of the things we've noticed in under the current president is that the president requests money to build a wall, and Congress doesn't give the money. President Obama's pet project was the Affordable Care Act, and he didn't get all the money he requested. President Bush, the first President Bush, wanted to create a program called the 1,000 Points of Lights, and he didn't get his money. And the second President Bush wanted to have a faith-based initiative and never got quite as much money as he wanted. And Bill Clinton had AmeriCorps, and he never quite got the amount of money he wanted. And that's just the Congress kind of sending a message to the president saying, we're giving you this power, but realize we can take it back anytime you want. And it's kind of a shot across the bow to make sure presidents don't exercise this abdicated authority in a bad way. But presidents are oftentimes pretty smart too, and they realize that if there are these programs that are kind of specific to me and my presidency, and I know if I send it to Congress and they're going to cut it, oftentimes presidents just ask for more money than they really need, and then the Congress cuts them appropriately, and the president gets almost everything they want in terms of their budget. Presidents produce a yearly budget. They send it to Congress for approval, and although presidents do not get everything they want, they get a vast majority of what they want, which is a huge power shift. The final of the administrative roles that presidents play is reorganization. Reality is that as Congress can organize its committees as it sees fit, and Congress is able to organize the judiciary as it sees fit based on the Constitution, there is this perception that the president, as the leader of the executive branch, should be able to reorganize his administrative unit. For instance, currently right now we have 15 executive departments. These departments are appointed by presidents. They directly communicate with the president. But the 15th department was a recent phenomenon. During the second President Bush's tenure, he decided to create the 15th department, the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security was basically an aggregation of other entities that existed in other departments, agencies, bureaus. But the president decided that he wanted to create a new department that would deal with Homeland Security. Presidents are basically given the ability to create their branch as they see fit, as different managers have different styles. Some like tall spans of control, some want smaller, some want they're very hands-on, or some are very hands-off. So the realization is that presidents should be allowed to organize their branch of government that works best for them. Now, we'll have to say at this point that the legislative branch has to approve reorganizations of the executive branch, but typically the legislature realizes that this is the president's area, and they defer and allow him to organize as he sees fit. The next role we want to talk about is policy role. Obviously, presidents are part and parcel of the public problem-solving approaches that we have here. They are in charge of policies. One of the more popular theories on how presidents play a role in policy is called the two presidents thesis. The two presidents thesis argues that we do not have one president of the United States, we have two. Those two presidents end up having very different success rates depending on which area they're in. The first policy area in the two presidents thesis is the international president. International policy deals with foreign affairs and military matters. Basically what we're talking about here is which countries are we going to befriend and which countries are we going to bomb. Presidents have huge success in this area. That success is not dependent on their previous experience in the military. We've had presidents that have been part of the military. We've had presidents that haven't been. But once they become president, they seem to get almost everything they want in this policy area. They befriend the ones they want to befriend. They create barriers to those they oppose. They attack countries they want to attack, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Congress defers to president when it comes to international affairs simply because presidents have more and better information. If you think about it, if we had a problem, say, in the country of Chad, Congress would probably defer to the president to solve that problem because they realize that although Congress has foreign relations committees, the president has an ambassador to Chad. He has the CIA. He has other intelligence agencies that report information directly back to him. The president's just going to have more information. He's going to be usually almost the sole decider. Well, if you're one of one decider, you're going to win a lot of these fights. One of the ways in which this happens is through something called an executive agreement. Executive agreements are not quite treaties. Remember, treaties are something that presidents make and the Senate confirms and approves of. Executive agreements aren't like that. They're kind of mini treaties. They're arrangements that presidents have with other places that last the president's term of office. They don't have treaty strength, but they are a way in which the president can make these kinds of policy decisions with foreign countries. The second of the two presidents in the two presidents thesis is related to domestic policy. Domestic policy are those areas that are within our own borders, things like taxes, transportation, education, healthcare. When we're talking about domestic political issues, the president no longer is one of one basic decider. When a president engages in domestic policy making, he is joined by 535 other actors, 535 being the number of House members and senators. Members of Congress realize that they get reelected based on domestic political issues. So they don't defer to the president at this point, they engage him. So domestic policy making becomes more complicated, convoluted, conflicted. And as such, presidents don't win as often. Presidents still have a tool in which they can have an impact here. It's called an executive order. Executive orders are the president's ability to direct bureaucrats to interpret statutes in a certain way. Thus, even if the president didn't have the kind of policy-making impacts in the creation, he can still have impacts as it is being carried out. The next presidential role is symbolic. One of the realities of the United States system is that a lot of what we kind of have, we borrowed from the United Kingdom. And one of the things the United Kingdom had done is they had split up their powers. They had split them up into a head of government, which in the United Kingdom is their prime minister, and that person was supposed to kind of solve problems related to, what should the tax rates be? What should our welfare system look like? which country should we bomb this afternoon? And the other side of this coin was the head of state. The head of state is the person who is the symbolic leader of the country. And in the United Kingdom, that is their monarch, currently Queen Elizabeth. And these jobs are very different. Queen Elizabeth gets put on the money. Queen Elizabeth watches the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. Queen Elizabeth is kind of a conduit between the United Kingdom and the world, so she'll go to foreign dignitaries' funerals. When the United States was created, we did not trust centralized rule, so we wanted to keep this in mind, so we divided our powers up similarly. We decided that we were going to have a head of government and we were going to have a head of state. Now, any clear reading of the Constitution realizes that if you want to know who the head of government was intended to be by the founders, it's the legislative branch. The legislative branch was first among the branches created. It's got the most words. It's got the most powers. If we were deciding who should make the tax rates and what kind of welfare program we should have and which country should we bomb, it should be the legislative branch. So we gave Congress the ability to be the head of government. Well, now we need to have somebody to be the head of state. And the founders said, this sounds like a great job for the president. The president is the one that is supposed to kind of be our symbolic leader. He's the one that's supposed to turn on the national Christmas tree. He's the one that's supposed to watch the Easter egg roll. When there is a foreign dignitary that has died, he goes to the funeral. The president is the one that calls up sports teams that have won championships. He's kind of our representative. Problem is, over time, the expectations have changed. We still think the president should be our symbolic leader. When the Lions win the Super Bowl in 24-36, we expect the Lions to go to the president's home, the White House, and give him a jersey in Honolulu blue and silver. The change has been is that it's difficult for Americans to kind of get their hands around 100 senators, 435 representatives, 2 chambers, 1 institution. So over time, we've just said, it's too hard. We're going to hold the president accountable for everything. We understand the president is second, not first. We understand that most of his powers are severely checked by Congress. But we're going to hold the president accountable for everything. Yes, they should be our symbolic leader, but to a large degree, we think they should be our head of government. The fifth of the presidential roles that we want to talk about is party leader. Being a party leader is completely outside the Constitution because, as we've read the Constitution, political parties aren't mentioned. However, it's difficult to make any kind of assertion about the president without also realizing that they are the de facto leader of their political party. For instance, I don't think anyone would doubt that in 2020, Donald Trump is the leader of the Republicans. In the same vein, if you went back to 2010, no one would doubt that Barack Obama was the leader of the Democrats. However, there is a reality to the fact that parties choose their own leader and for the most part are not the sitting president, but de facto-ly, presidents that sit in office become their party leader. So they have to perform that kind of functionality for their political party. People look at them as being the leader of the party, so they have to behave as the leader of their party. One of the things that we kind of tend to see as party leaders, they need to perform a couple of fairly large functions. They need to raise resources so they in turn can get their party members elected. One of the things that we notice is that presidents being party leaders, they tend to do much better when their names are on the ballot. Keep in mind that presidential terms are 4-year terms, but the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate is up every 2. So we have this idea that presidential elections, the president is on the ballot. Presidents tend to be better party leaders then. In off-year elections where the president isn't on the ballot, but there's been a time frame that's out there that the public kind of reacts slightly negatively towards the president, that they tend to want to take their anger out of the president, but they're not on the ballot, so they tend to punish the president's party. So we tend to see that presidents lose positions in the House and the Senate. Their party loses those. even though they don't lose their office. Presidents raise a lot of funds to get their party members elected, and depending on how good they are at this particular role, they have more or less success getting their people elected.